Welcome to this explainer. We often think of military intelligence as a simple math problem, right? Better information equals better outcomes. But what happens when you have absolutely perfect information, yet the conclusion you draw from it is just disastrously wrong? Let's dive into a wild paradox from December 1944.
How exactly did flawless intelligence lead to defeat? It's a fascinating question, and the answer reveals a profound cultural misunderstanding that literally changed the course of history. You see, in the winter of '44, the German army gathered incredibly accurate data on American forces in the Ardennes forest. Yet, this flawless data marched them right into their greatest defeat on the Western Front. To figure out why, we've got to look at what they were actually measuring.
Section 1. The Ghost Front. To really get what happened here, picture the battlefield itself. We're talking about 100 miles of unforgiving, dense forest and narrow, winding roads. Allied command basically used this area as a quiet zone to rest their battered divisions and break in the totally green ones. The American lines were paper-thin, stretched way out over massive distances. And while the Americans treated it like a sleepy, quiet sector, across the line, the Germans were quietly taking notes. Get a load of the evidence these German night patrols brought back. It was just baffling. They were slipping completely undetected, not just up to the American lines, but right through them. I mean, think about what you'd conclude if you saw this. Forward positions abandoned for about 10 hours a night while soldiers slept in warm dugouts. No mines, zero tripwires. Scouts could hear guys talking loudly, vehicle engines just idling away, and they could see campfires burning brightly in the distance. They were doing almost no combat reconnaissance. By any standard of European military professionalism, this just wasn't an army acting like an army.
Section 2. Perfect intelligence, fatal flaw.
So all this flawlessly gathered evidence lands directly on the desk of a highly capable German armored commander, General Hasso von Manteuffel. Looking at the raw data, the High Command drew a totally logical yet completely fatal conclusion. They saw a disconnected bunch of isolated islands manned by sloppy soldiers who literally went to bed when the sun went down. To Manteuffel, this uncoordinated, undisciplined army was going to crumble instantly. It wasn't a defended front, it was just an open door. Here's where it gets crazy. Manteuffel takes this intelligence to Hitler and actually convinces him to throw standard German military doctrine out the window. Usually, you'd kick off an offensive with a massive artillery barrage, right? But Manteuffel argued that artillery would just wake the Americans up and let them call in their own devastating guns. Instead, he proposed something radical. Use those 10 empty hours of darkness to silently slip shock troops right through the gaps his patrols had mapped out.
Under absolute secrecy, the Germans amassed a staggering 250,000 men, 250,000 troops, nearly 1,000 tanks, and almost 2,000 artillery pieces right there in the Eifel forest. They even muffled their tank engines with straw and maintained absolute radio silence. It was literally the largest secret military buildup on the Western Front since D-Day. And the Americans? They largely noticed nothing until it was far too late.
Section 3. The 18 at Lanzerhof.
Now that brilliant infiltration plan violently collided with reality. On the morning of December 16th, things worked exactly to plan for the first few hours, until a massive column of 500 elite German paratroopers marched toward a ridge just outside the tiny village of Lanzerhof. They fully expected to sweep right through this supposedly empty, undefended sector.
But waiting on that frozen ridge were exactly 18 Americans. And this wasn't even some hardened infantry squad. It was a small intelligence and reconnaissance unit led by a 20-year-old lieutenant named Lyle Buck. According to German intelligence, an inexperienced unit like this should have folded instantly. But instead, Lieutenant Buck told his guys to hold their fire until the Germans were practically stepping on them, and then they unleashed a devastating volley.
The stakes that morning were just astronomical. Backed up directly behind those 500 paratroopers were 4,000 men and 100 tanks of Kampfgruppe Piper, the absolute heavy hitters of the German assault. Their entire advance required that single road. Yet Lieutenant Buck's 18 guys dug in and held them off for 20 grueling hours. The entire northern half of Hitler's timetable ground to a total halt, all because 18 men refused to behave the way the intelligence reports said they would.
Section 4. Organized chaos at Bastogne.
Lieutenant Buck's men were ultimately captured once they ran out of ammo, but their impossible, stubborn stand was repeating itself all across the Ardennes, most famously at Bastogne. This town was an incredibly crucial crossroads. 7 major roads converged right here in a landscape where the terrain severely restricted armor movement. The Germans simply had to take Bastogne to push westward. Instead, they ended up surrounding it, trapping a total patchwork of American units inside.
The defense of this surrounded city was essentially an exercise in organized chaos. It defied every single standard of European military professionalism. Just look at this list. There was no master plan. Engineers who were just building roads days prior were suddenly fighting as frontline infantry. Junior officers in their 20s were making huge command decisions that would normally require a colonel's sign-off in the German army. At one point, a major literally borrowed tanks from a completely unassociated unit just by asking. To a Prussian observer, this looked like a total collapse of discipline. But to the Americans, it was just Tuesday. When the German commander finally sent over a formal, written ultimatum demanding the honorable surrender of Bastogne, the acting American commander, General Anthony McAuliffe, sent back a legendary, defiant, and completely confusing single-word reply: nuts. The German officers actually had to get an American colonel to translate that it basically meant go to hell. And you know what? The garrison held.
Section 5. The Real American Doctrine.
So why on earth did places like Bastogne and Lanzarote hold out when the intelligence said they absolutely shouldn't? Well, it all comes down to a core difference the Germans completely missed. Prussian military discipline relied on strict hierarchy. Order flows downward. If the commander goes down, the unit freezes and waits for new orders from above. The proof of their discipline was sentries standing at attention and immaculate uniforms. But the American doctrine was engineered fundamentally differently. It actively assumed that the initial plan was going to fail. When the chain of command broke, initiative pushed outward. If a captain falls, a lieutenant takes over. If the lieutenant falls, a sergeant looks at the dirt in front of him and builds a brand new plan from the ruins.
And when these guys improvised, they tapped into devastatingly flexible systems, like the Fire Direction Center. Picture this. A single 23-year-old forward observer spots a target, radios in pre-computed map coordinates, and within 3 minutes, concentrated artillery fire from entirely separate battalions rains down on that exact spot. This level of rapid, bottom-up coordination was something the rigid German system just couldn't replicate, and it completely shattered their timetable. By January 25, 1945, the bill for this massive systemic misunderstanding came due. The losses were absolutely staggering. 120,000 men, 800 tanks, 1,000 aircraft. The offensive that was supposed to completely break the Allied line was basically erased. The Germans had flawless intelligence on the surface of the American army, but they were dead wrong about what it actually meant underneath. Section 6. A delayed redemption. We can't wrap up this explainer without returning to the human element, specifically Lieutenant Book. He spent the rest of the war freezing in a POW camp. Turning 21, surrounded by shattered men, he kept remembering his Aunt Mildred, telling him that if he lived past his 21st birthday, he'd have a good life. But sitting there in the cold, he honestly believed he had totally failed his mission. He had no clue that his desperate, improvised stand had quite literally altered the course of the war. He came home quietly, became a chiropractor, and rarely spoke about what happened.
It took 37 years for the army to fully grasp what really happened at Lanzarote. Finally, in 1981, Book's chaotic, desperate defense got the recognition it deserved. His 18-man intelligence platoon was recognized as the most decorated American platoon for a single action in all of World War II. It proved, once and for all, that their ability to adapt and fight without clear top-down orders was exactly what broke the momentum of the German offensive's most critical push. I'm going to leave you with this provocative thought. The Germans accurately reported every single thing they saw, but they were basically measuring a fish by its ability to climb a tree. It's a huge reminder for all of us, whether you're looking at history, business, or everyday life. Measuring discipline just by how neat and quiet things look blinds you to true resilience. The real question isn't what a system looks like at rest, but what it's capable of doing when everything else falls apart. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. I hope it gave you a whole new perspective on how we interpret information. Keep learning, and I'll catch you on the next one.